Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, what Robert Mueller failed to fully investigate in his Russia probe.
A big part of their effort was designed to suppress African-American voter turnout.
How the Russians produced these attacks on Hillary Clinton.
This woman is a witch. You know, he tried to pretend like an angel, but she's an evildoer.
How fake Russian Facebook posts urged African-American voters to vote from home by text, something not possible to do.
When you look at the black vote in Philadelphia, in Detroit, and in Milwaukee, it wasn't what it was in 2012.
The precise same tactics Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort put in place. Just a coincidence?
Some kinds of coordination could have been taking place.
Plus, showdown with Iran, a British ship seized, alleged CIA spies captured, back and forth cyber attacks. Is a quiet war already underway?
Iran has to be very, very careful.
And our shout-out for the South Carolina reporter whose stories helped send a top prosecutor to jail for using public money to go on vacation and led to investigations of powerful county sheriffs for corruption and covering up their misdeeds.
Time and again, we're finding that politics and law enforcement don't mix.
From the Law and Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, what you did not hear about during the testimony of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller before Congress. The facts of how the Russians targeted African-American voters in an effort to keep them from going to the polls, a strategy that almost exactly paralleled that of the Trump campaign during the last election. Political pros call it voter suppression. So how was it that a group of Russians in an office building in St. Petersburg were able to precisely target the same voters that Republicans were targeting here? Just a coincidence?
The misinformation effort on the part of Russian trolls.
This morning we're learning Russian interference went beyond the election.
The Russians set up 30 Facebook pages targeting African Americans.
There's been all this talk from the Mueller report to the Senate and House investigatory committees about the fact of Russian interference
in the 2016 presidential election.
What there hasn't been is an examination on how they sought to interfere in our elections.
Mark Morial, a former mayor of New Orleans, now runs the National Urban League.
It appears as though a big part of their effort was designed to suppress African-American voter turnout.
All she wants is power.
By, for example, creating trolls and memes and fake personalities who were associated and aligned with the Black Lives Matter movement, and use those, if you will, mouthpieces to suggest that African Americans should not vote.
This woman is a witch. You know, he tried to pretend like an angel, but she's an evildoer.
They created, if you will, a meme, a social media meme, under the banner of African Americans for Hillary Clinton, as though it was coming from a group of African Americans who supported Hillary Clinton. Had her photo on it. What it said is, avoid the lines, vote from home, text to this number.
Of course, there was no way to vote from home or to vote via text.
Now, people would say, well, who would be so gullible? Consider an 18, 19, 21-year-old person who's grown up in the social media world, who all of a sudden sees something coming, quote unquote, from the campaign, suggesting that they could vote from home.
And it all came from Russia, from an operation called the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, with what U.S. officials say was surprising sophistication in its deception. According to the Pew Research Center, turnout among African-American voters was down substantially in the 2016 election, from 66% of eligible voters to 60% of eligible voters, a decrease of 765,000 nationwide.
We had such a close election that if the Russians succeeded in simply fooling some of the people, some of the time, in only some of the states, they could have affected this election. I wonder who in the United States may have been cooperating with them, or assisting them, or aiding them, or abetting them. I can't answer that question.
One answer comes from what happened on the top floor of this building in New York City at a private cigar club where, according to the Mueller report, it was here that Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, quote, briefed Kilimnik, identified by the FBI as a Russian operative, on the state of the Trump campaign and Manafort's plan to win the election. That briefing encompassed the campaign's messaging and its internal polling data.
In the
Former special counsel Mueller confirmed all of that and more in his congressional testimony this week.
Months before that meeting, Manafort had caused internal data to be shared with Kilimnik, and the sharing continued for some period of time after their August meeting. Isn't that correct?
Accurate.
It also included a discussion of battleground states, which Manafort identified as Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Minnesota.
Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Who knows what was going on with the president? But at least at the Manafort level, I think there's very strong evidence, if not yet a smoking gun, that some kinds of coordination could have been taking place.
Congressman Jamie Raskin is a Democrat from Maryland who serves on the House Judiciary Committee.
But does it make sense to you the people at the IRA, the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia, would figure out to go after black votes in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania?
Well, we don't know whether or not it was just a coincidence. So we know from the Mueller report that there was a sweeping and systematic campaign by the Russians to undermine and subvert our presidential election in order to throw it to Donald Trump. And now we have reportage that the Russians were deliberately trying to suppress African American women from turning out in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, and other places. And it looks like that strategy was parallel to a Republican strategy.
And joining us now from Washington to talk about all this is Jill Wine-Banks, a former member of the Watergate Special Prosecutors Team and a former executive director of the American Bar Association. Thank you for being here. Let me ask you, Jill Wine-Banks, do you believe in coincidences?
I'm not a believer in coincidences or conspiracy theories. Of course, it's certainly obvious that the voters who needed to be suppressed were African American women, but it is not a coincidence that that's the exact information and polling data that Manafort turned over to the Russians, and probably for financial gain. He was using his knowledge to try to get out of some debts to oligarchs in Russia.
Well, do you think Robert Mueller did enough to investigate this aspect? It seems to have these parallel political campaigns, one from St. Petersburg, Russia, one from the Trump campaign.
I think he established the Russian hacking and the social media segment, but he did not follow the money, which, going back to Watergate, following the money is exactly the way to find things. And in this case, there's a lot of financial motives for the cooperation with Russia. Donald Trump wanted to make millions, hundreds of millions from the Trump power. And so he continued to do it. And the same thing is true for Manafort, who owed a great debt in Russia. And he used this power that he had and knowledge that he had to try to win over some of the oligarchs to relieve his debt.
Jill, we have a question for you from the control room from our executive producer, Rhonda Schwartz.
Jill, you're a former prosecutor. Why couldn't Mueller do more on this? Why was it beyond his purview? With all our intelligence agencies, couldn't they investigate further?
Appointment announcement. And that said that he was to investigate whether or not the Russians had hacked and interfered in our election in any way, and whether anyone on the Trump team was involved in that action, which is not the same thing as whether or not they had shared polling data, I guess. I think it's a logical extension, and that if I were making the decision as Robert Mueller as to whether or not I had jurisdiction, I would have erred on the side of inclusiveness, and I would have probably investigated further. Now, there is clearly future cases still pending. And so the question is whether this is one of the ones that he did not resolve, but he did not close, and that it's one of the ones he can't talk about because it's still pending.
So you think more might be coming very quickly, Jill?
I don't know if it'd be quick, but I think there's more coming for sure.
Jill Wine-Banks, thank you so much for being in our program tonight. Very much appreciated. Coming up next,
Thank you, Brian.
You bet. Coming up next, is America on the verge of going to war with Iran? In fact, is a secret cyber war already underway? When we return. In a summer of shark sightings, racist tweets from the White House, and children held in cages along the southern border, we may have lost sight of the distinct possibility we could end up at war with Iran. Some suggest we're already engaged in a tit-for-tat cyber war. Iran has seized a British ship, claims it disrupted a CIA spy network, and acted in what the U.S. says is a deliberately provocative manner in the strategic shipping lanes of the Gulf of Hormuz. And while President Trump has not authorized any military action, he has disclosed the U.S. has conducted cyber attacks on Iran and issued a stern warning.
We'll see what happens with Iran. Iran has to be very, very careful.
Joining us now to talk about all this is Karen Greenberg, the Executive Director of the Center for National Security at the Fordham Law School. And by Skype from Cambridge, Massachusetts, Matt Bunn, a professor at Harvard, one of the world's great experts on nuclear proliferation and terrorism. Thank you both for being here. Matt Bunn, let me start with you. Do you think we're on the brink of something?
I think it's very dangerous right now. We have a situation in the fairly crowded Strait of Hormuz with lots of different military forces operating, not only there, but in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria. There are lots of things that could clash inadvertently and be the spark for the beginning of a war. Meanwhile, there is strong tensions because of the sanctions that the United States has imposed after pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal. So there's no negotiations underway to resolve the situation. So the situation is really fraught with danger at the moment, I think.
And you feel one false step could lead to something quite disastrous?
Indeed. We've seen situations before where things happened that neither commander actually wanted to happen. In 1988, a U.S. ship shot down a Iranian civilian airplane, killing everyone aboard. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were all sorts of events that almost led to war that neither Khrushchev nor Kennedy ordered to happen. So there's, just like there's a fog of war, there's a fog of crisis that can lead to events that nobody wanted to have happen.
Karen Greenberg, let me ask you, there's been talk of a cyber war already underway with attacks from both sides at each other.
Yeah, it's almost like a parallel conversation that's going on in the conflict between the United States and Iran. And what you're seeing is parallel to the seizure of ships, the shooting down of drones that we've seen. What you've seen is a parallel war going on. Lots of it we know we don't hear about, but we've heard about some of it, which has to do with us attacking Iranian intelligence networks and Iranians targeting our financial and other networks. And some of it's theft, some of it's ransomware, and some of it's just to show that they can do it. But it is getting more and more intense. It's been going on over the course of the last couple of months. And it is not helped by the fact that the bellicose language from the president makes it so that he's pushing Iran further and further. You know, first he withdraws from the JCPOA. Then he declares the IRGC a terrorist organization. And then we begin to retaliate both in terms of activity and in terms of rhetoric. So I agree with Matt. We are in an extremely dangerous situation without a real sense of who would be in command to say this is what should happen, either in the cyberspace or in the kinetic space.
So far, no shots fired, but President Trump has acknowledged a cyber attack.
No, absolutely. And no shots have been fired, but leading national security experts often say that the next war, the next hot war we see, will be introduced via cyber war. And so how you make that distinction, what the moment becomes, where it becomes kinetic and violent and causes death, is a matter of time.
Matt Budd, do you think that this cyber war could lead to shots being fired?
Absolutely, and arguably there are shots being fired already in the sense that there were these mines that damaged several tankers that were attributed to the Iranians. There was the shoot down of the American drone. President Trump launched a military strike on Iran, which he called off at the very last moment. So I think we're closer than many Americans realize to the brink. There are senior people in the administration who believe that it would be a good thing to have military strikes against Iran to take out parts of their nuclear program. I personally think that would be a disastrous, potentially catastrophic move, because we could set their nuclear program back, but only for a few years, and they would likely rebuild in secret. And there are many things throughout the Middle East that they could do in response. There's a real danger of setting the whole Middle East even more on fire than it already is.
And Karen, in a war like that, huge casualties.
Listen, people have been starting to talk about the difference between the war with Iraq and what a war with Iran would be. And estimates of people who lived through the Iraq war in positions of command and official authority have said almost to a person that the Iran war would dwarf what the Iraq war looked like. And again, the allegations of they're tied to the greatest terrorist organizations in the world are just not true. And the amount of impact that Iran has been able to have in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere has been much less than the rhetoric surrounding it. And so I do think we are in a dangerous situation. And I think, and there's also, as Matt pointed out in the beginning, not a minor point, the lack of diplomacy that has any kind of space now. I think you might have seen that Foreign Minister Zarif has offered to talk to the members of Congress. Yeah. That's interesting because there's a hunger for diplomacy. It has to happen. And right now, there are no avenues for it.
Karen Greenberg from the National Security Center at Fordham Law, thank you very much. Matt Bunn in Harvard, thank you very much for joining us tonight. When we come back, our shout out for the reporter in South Carolina who took on one of the state's most powerful groups. It's 46 county sheriffs. Now a number of them could end up behind bars. And our shout out tonight for an investigative reporter in South Carolina who took on one of the state's most powerful groups. It's 46 county sheriffs. As in most states, it's an elective office, and the local sheriffs in South Carolina rarely get much attention.
No reaction to the taxpayers. Absolutely nothing.
It was a tip to a local investigative reporter that led this summer to prison time for powerful South Carolina prosecutor Dan Johnson. Reporter Tony Bartlemy of the Post and Courier in Charleston, South Carolina, found the evidence he needed for his story on the prosecutor in Johnson's own expense reports.
Nobody had looked at them yet. Nobody had sifted through them. So I got a hold of them, started looking through them, and a bunch of things just immediately popped out.
Including a $173 Uber ride in Minneapolis, where Bartlemy used to live.
And I thought, I bet you he went to Prince's house on the public's dime. And lo and behold, that's exactly what he did. And during that trip, he also spent money on a Major League Baseball game, the Twins. And from there, we started looking into other things like trips to the Galapagos Islands, first-class plane trips to all over the country, and things like that.
Bartlemy, who is the senior reporter on the Post and Courier's investigative team, says they decided to expand their probe into all official expense reports.
So we thought, what are other islands of government in South Carolina that kind of exist on their own without much scrutiny? And sheriffs immediately came to mind. And so we sought every spending record we could get from every county in the state, all 46 counties.
Suspended Greenville County Sheriff Will Lewis is facing more charges tonight.
Among those highlighted by Bartlemy was Sheriff Will Lewis of Greenville County, now facing criminal charges that he was using public money to carry on a sexual relationship with an employee who has now claimed she was raped. He has denied the charges and her claims.
Her allegations that basically forced her to have sex, forced her to do other things, and used that fear of termination, losing her job, as a cudgel.
Next was the sheriff of Florence County.
People who live in the area are speaking out after the man they elected, Sheriff Kenny Boone, was arrested and charged with embezzlement and misconduct in office.
Sheriff Kenny Boone is also now facing state charges as a result of Bartlemy's reporting. He too has pleaded not guilty.
Again, it was all these sort of questionable expenses for personal gain.
The most serious charges came following Bartlemy's story on Sheriff Alex Underwood.
Underwood had a pattern of misbehavior ranging from assaults He'd assaulted a couple of fire chiefs at a traffic stop. And also a man was live streaming a traffic wreck.
As the man was streaming his video on Facebook, Sheriff Underwood is seen approaching him and can be heard challenging him.
I'm doing a manhunt out here. I got somebody that's armed and dangerous out here. Get on the porch.
There was a scuffle. Essentially, Underwood and his deputies threw the guy in jail, cooked up a bunch of bogus charges, and then tried to cover up when the FBI began to investigate.
Sheriff Underwood is now under federal indictment. He has pleaded not guilty to the charges.
Well, when we put it all together, we produced a very large package of stories that really kind of captured the scope and significance of and history of why sheriffs have gotten into trouble.
Bartleby says his editors know such investigative reporting takes time and money, but that they have decided it is the only way local newspapers can survive.
In the past few years, we've analyzed the data and we've found that people are more likely to subscribe to stories that are done with depth and quality. We found that the sheriff story, for instance, generated the most subscriptions of any story last year or this year. On a local level, it's really the only way we'll be able to survive. And we are finding that investigative journalism, though it's expensive, is what keeps people reading.
So our shout out tonight for Tony Bartleby and his editors, demonstrating how investigative reporting can do good and do well. On a personal note, Tony's father, Joe, was one of broadcast journalism's great, and I was fortunate enough to have worked for him when I first started my career at NBC News. Nice to see Tony's carrying on the tradition of journalism with an impact. That's our program for tonight. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next week.